Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 56, and today I'm here with Iris Chen talking about Untigering. Iris is an author, unschooling mom, deconstructing tiger parent, and founder of the Untigering movement. As an advocate for peaceful parenting and educational freedom for children, her mission is to inspire generational and cultural transformation, especially among Asian communities. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. Zoe Donnelly writes, love this podcast. I've been slowly working my way through all the episodes of this podcast over the past couple months and have learned so much. Everything that is discussed by Rachel and her guests makes so much sense to me on a deep level. It's like she's turning on the lights in a dark room and I'm able to see things so clearly now that were all blurry and out of focus before. Thank you, Rachel. You help soothe my soul and fill me with hope and excitement knowing there is a better path out there. Thank you so much for taking the time to write that review, Zoe. And if you are enjoying the Sage Family Podcast, then please scroll down and click those stars in your podcast app or on iTunes. Writing a review is a quick and easy way to support the show using the currency of feedback. About once a week, we meet up with the other family in our pod to play in nature, and we have discovered some awesome places around us that we never even knew existed by simply typing "hike near me" into Google. Each time we choose a place we've never been, and it's just the best. Sometimes the places are huge hits and we plan to come back, and other times they're not, but it's always an exciting adventure to explore a new place. I also want to note that it's always free and we don't let the weather stop us. We hiked 2 miles through the nearby forest yesterday in the cold rain with our puppies, and we were all better for it. And it provided a perfect excuse for hot chocolate afterward. Our little obsession right now is our new front doors. As you know, if you've listened to the intro to this podcast, we live in a fixer-upper and get a lot of joy out of working on the house together. Well, I've posted on Instagram before about our challenges with our small, dark, split-level entry and our front door that perpetually bled rust despite our construction first aid. And now we've put in new glass front doors for the main house and my dad's in-law suite, and they have made a world of difference. So light and open. There was quite a learning curve on the installation of front doors in this very old and odd, in the most frustrating and charming way, house. But my husband is like Hawaiian MacGyver meets Chip Gaines. So after a couple very cold winter days with gaping holes in our house, we could not be happier. If you want to see photos and videos of our adventures or our doors, then head on over to sage.family on Instagram and follow along. In her new book, Untigering, Peaceful Parenting for the Deconstructing Tiger Parent, Iris uses honest vulnerability, sharp intellect, and cultural awareness to show us all how to shift the cultural tide within us away from the oppression of children and the oppression of our own authentic selves. This book is a truly refreshing and inspiring lens for the gentle parenting and unschooling journey. Welcome to the show, Iris.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Sure. So, yes, my name is Iris. I just Iris Chen, and I just released a book, Untigering. I've been blogging about peaceful parenting and unschooling for several years on my Untigering blog. And I guess just a little bit of background. I am Chinese American. I grew up as a child of immigrants. And as an adult, I moved out to China and lived there for many years, raised my family there, and just recently came back to the States after over 16 years there.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
talk to us about the title of the book and the dominant style of parenting within that culture.
So I came up with this term untigering to sort
love
of
it.
describe my own process and experience. And sometimes people read the word and they're like, is it supposed to say untriggering? Because what kind of word is untigering? But this is sort of referring to tiger parenting and how, especially in my experience, growing up as, a child of immigrants and Asian American culture, where tiger parenting was the norm among my friends and those that I knew. And so I think of untigering as that process of deconstructing and detoxing from that way of parenting, whether that be, healing our childhood wounds and detoxing from the way that we were parented, and also trying to move away from those patterns as we parent the next generation as well.
Okay, let's talk about the narrative piece, because I talk a lot about narratives or the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, because challenging those is always a big part of growth. And you describe your narrative as being built on wounds and achievements, which I know so many of us can relate to. Can you share how that affected your early parenting?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the patterns that we live in, whether that be parenting or just in life in general, do have a lot to do with our childhood wounds. And so for me, like growing up in an very authoritarian culture and family dynamic, I think I learned how to behave. I learned how to perform. I learned that the positive affirmation and attention that I got was based on how good I was, whether that be doing well in school or behaving well, being obedient, all those things.
Yeah.
And so I think when I became a parent, those expectations, like I still had those expectations to perform well, to be perceived as good and as competent or whatever as a parent. And so I think I really wanted to control my children because of that, because I wanted to maintain that image or maintain those expectations upon them. So that really, pressured me to use control and coercion over my children in order to maintain that image.
Yeah. What do you believe about the nature of children now that you may have misunderstood before in those early days?
So I totally thought that it was my responsibility to control them, actually, that's what made me a good parent, right?
Yeah.
That we needed to produce well-behaved children who listened to their parents and, didn't cause any inconvenience of any kind.
Discipline the childishness out of them.
Yes, exactly. We wanted them to sit still, not get upset, not have tantrums and all that stuff. So I did have a very adultist view towards children, not really seeing them as having any right to their own emotions or their own desires, like it was my responsibility to train them, to discipline them, all those things. And I think as I began this entire process, I realized how very dehumanizing that was, and how I didn't treat my children as full human beings. And that once I began to see that, I couldn't unsee it.
Right.
it really exposed ways that I oppressed them as a parent, and I totally thought I was justified in doing so. And so I think it's definitely shifted my attitude towards them once I do see them as full human beings who are worthy of respect and autonomy and unconditional love. And so that my role as a parent is no longer to control them and to guarantee some sort of result or behavior from them, but really to honor them, support them, love them unconditionally. So yeah, that was a huge shift.
On the topic of your role as a parent, I'm going to read a quote from your book. The burden is not upon our children to change, but upon us as the parents. This is an inconvenient truth when I'd rather deflect blame and play the victim, but the reality is that I'm the adult. It's my responsibility to get free. My children aren't to blame for triggering me, pushing my buttons, or driving me up the wall. I have to actively work through those triggers, remove those buttons, and tear down the wall instead of expecting my children to change their behavior before I change mine. Oh, I love that quote. It's so profound and poignantly sort of illustrates this discrepancy between like what a lot of us believe the role of a parent is and really what it needs to be if we want to create like a world full of liberated people.
Absolutely. Yeah, like in the early days of parenting, I really saw my children as making life difficult for me. Like I thought it was their responsibility to, make parenting easy for me. And when they didn't, it was so frustrating. And I definitely took it as something willful that they were doing to, push my buttons. I had this line in the early part of my book where I was saying that motherhood ruined my straight A reputation. And where, because I felt like it should be something that makes me feel good about myself, where I can give myself a pat on the back because I'm doing such a great job. And motherhood really, burst that bubble where I wasn't in control. I couldn't control, this other human being. And it made me feel helpless and incompetent and frustrated, and really realizing that those were things that I needed to work through.
Yes.
That they weren't really things that, my child was doing to me, but it was just bringing up these feelings of insecurity, feelings of, worthlessness and all that stuff that our children's behavior can trigger in us. But it is, like I said, my responsibility to understand that and not to take it out on my kids, not to expect them to, change or behave in ways to make me feel good about myself.
Yeah.
But for me to be aware so that I can meet them with more understanding and meet myself with more compassion and understanding as well.
Yeah, like all that stuff is yours to own. It's not theirs.
Right.
Yes. Okay, at one point you realized that behaviors are attempts to get needs met. How did things change for you once you made that shift?
That was a huge shift for me because, like I mentioned before, I interpreted quote unquote misbehavior as, willful disobedience, as them being rebellious or, just
as being about you instead of about them and their own and their needs.
Right. I didn't see it as about needs at all. It was just they were being difficult, being demanding, being bratty, or whatever term that I labeled it. But I think once I was able to see that these were just attempts at getting their needs met, I was able to, see what was underneath the surface. There's that infographic or whatever about the iceberg, and what we see is the tip of the iceberg, those behaviors, but there's so much going on underneath. And if we understood what was going underneath, we could just meet those behaviors with so much more understanding and compassion. So yeah, I think that really shifted my perspective. Because I think when we see things as misbehavior, then we become very punitive. We feel like we need to respond with consequences, with, you know, limits or punishment or whatever those things are. But when we see them as attempts to get their needs met, then we can really empathize with them, and then we can coach them and teach them other ways, like maybe more appropriate ways to meet their needs. And in some ways, there is really no need for punishment at all because we're not going to use fear to, keep them from doing those things that we dislike, but we are actually giving them the tools that they need to help get their needs met.
Yeah. Once you realize that those behaviors are attempts at getting needs met, the whole discipline question kind of becomes obsolete, because when you focus on getting the need met, like there is no need to like modify the behavior, because the behavior is more like the symptom of the need. So if you meet the need, then like the issue's resolved. It's resolved much more efficiently, much more effectively. And then, like you said, you're giving them the tools for the next time that need comes up, where they can try to use these other ways of getting their needs met more effectively.
Yeah, and then once they see those things in action, they realize that, oh, this does help me get what I need in a more effective and more peaceful way. And so, yeah, they don't need to engage in those other ways of getting their needs met. So,
yeah. Okay. In the book, you say, while emotions still feel somewhat foreign and uncomfortable for me, I'm slowly getting back in touch with my humanity. I'm trying to name my feelings and make room for them. I'm starting to pause and listen to what they're trying to tell me instead of ignoring them. How did you become so disconnected from your own feelings, and how are you supporting your children in maintaining a connection with theirs?
I think part of it is definitely cultural, within at least my own experience growing up in a Chinese family, we did not talk about emotions very often. Like, the way to show care and to greet one another in Chinese culture is to ask, have you eaten yet? So it's not like, how are you feeling? What are you doing? It's like wondering whether or not your basic needs of survival and sustenance are met. And so a lot of the family relationship and the parental relationship is very practical in Chinese culture, at least in my experience. There isn't a lot of talking about emotions or feelings, and those are often discouraged. Like, you shouldn't be crying all the time. You shouldn't be upset. It's like, so I think part of it for me was definitely not having that vocabulary given to me, not having it named and welcomed in my family. And also seeing sometimes when emotions were expressed, it was derided. And so it became sort of unsafe to be vulnerable and to express emotion. I think that's what I saw growing up. That's what I internalized in my beliefs about emotions. And so it took a long time. I mean, even in other relationships that I had, whether it was in dating relationships or, in my marriage relationship with my husband, emotions felt very threatening and vulnerable. It made me feel very vulnerable. It was easier to be angry, to be frustrated and upset than to admit I was hurt, or I felt insecure, or I felt, that I was ignored, because those just felt weak in some ways. Those felt, And so I think it took a lot of just time and process and healing to recognize that in my own life, and to realize how that really hurt me, and where I had to cut off a lot of who I was in order to protect myself in that way. It was a protective mechanism.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really was preventing me from having close, intimate, authentic relationships with people. And so that was a part of myself that I needed to reconnect to. I needed to be brave and vulnerable enough to show who I truly was. And it's been a huge part of my healing journey, for myself to make room for my emotions. And, I think in parenting, seeing our kids have these big emotions, it can be very triggering. And as I sort of began that process with myself and um, just seeing how that allowed me to hold more space for my children to have those big emotions. And yeah, it's definitely not easy. I'm still in process, but I can recognize the difference, and I can see just the need to continue doing that work of being in tune with my emotions and attuning to my children's.
Yeah, and I'm sure you doing that work and healing sort of through your parenting has also been a big part of them sort of learning from a much earlier age than you had the privilege of learning from, that emotions are natural and normal and healthy, and within secure, trusting relationships is a safe space to like be fully authentic and to show all those layers of emotion and to talk about them and to name them and to really bring them to the forefront of your awareness, where you can actually work with them and see how they're affecting your thoughts and your actions.
Absolutely. And I think there are so many resources out there, and um, just realizing that I needed a lot of help because I didn't have this modeled for me.
Yeah.
I felt like I was starting from scratch in a lot of ways. But yeah, even when they were younger, like printing up like a wheel of emotions, where it breaks down and has vocabulary for very nuanced different emotions, and talking that over with my kids and just giving them that language and that vocabulary to express how they're feeling at any given moment. So
Yeah. I've worked with a coaching client once who came from a similar culture, and we would introduce like one new feeling, like a really nuanced, specific feeling each week. and
uh-huh.
and she would like look for that feeling in the world, like in other people around her, in
Uh-huh.
herself. What did it feel like? What did it sound like what did she feel in her body when she was feeling that? And like sometimes it really can be as like basic and simple as like just start with one feeling, like something really specific but that seems quite foreign to you, and start to like get to know that feeling, like meet that emotion like it's someone that is just being introduced to you for the first time.
That is such a good practice. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about success. So, how was success defined for you growing up, and how have you redefined it?
Mm. I think for me, it wasn't necessarily something that was explicitly, told to me by my family. I think in some ways my family gave me a lot of freedom compared to other Asian American families, but just through culture, through, the school environment or everything around me, I did internalize certain messages about success where it was based on performance. It was based on how you appeared to other people. Um, it was based on, yeah, just these social status markers of what, made you um, appeal or be considered excellent in the world's eyes. And so I think in tiger parenting in particular, I sort of broke it down into the three S's, which were status, stats, and status quo, where the status is about, yeah, just comparing yourself to other people. Where do you rank? Um, what is your class? Like
Income
how,
level.
yes, like how you're perceived by the world, and are you are you considered well-to-do or, in society. And then the stats were just about all those markers and metrics, those numbers that we use to measure
Grades.
whether or not we have made it in the world,
Got it.
our GPA, our our SAT score or whatever, all those things that we grew up focusing on, those numbers that we grew up focusing on. And then the status quo piece is just wanting to stick with what was practical in life, seeing how other people achieve success and then just following along on those trails that other people have blazed for us and assuming that those are the only ways to achieve success. So yeah, I think I fell into that thinking and just wanting to pursue success in certain ways just because that's how I saw everybody else doing it. But, then I became an unschooler and all that sort of went out the window. Yeah, like when my kids were young, I was continuing to think in those with that tiger parenting mindset where still wanting them to be high achievers, wanting them to just have a lot of accomplishments based on what I thought was important in life. And once I discovered unschooling, really needing to unpack that and consider, okay, where did I get these ideas from? Are these actually important? And are these meaningful for my child? How can I honor my child's autonomy and respect them in the individual and in the unique way that they want to show up in the world?
Yes.
So yes, I no longer valued those 3 S's in the same way. And I really wanted my kids to have the freedom and that autonomy to pursue a type of success that made sense for them.
Yeah, even in terms of like, what does it mean to be successful as a parent? Like I even just throughout your book, like I could see the evolution, sort of unspoken in the beginning, like what does it mean to be a successful parent? I would imagine your answer would be things like to have children who like satisfy those 3 S's, right? And then by the end, it felt so different. Like now, what do you think it would mean? Like if you had to define, what would it mean to be a successful parent now?
Yeah, one of the one of my quotes in the book was, I think it said, like, the main work of the parent is to become our best selves. Yeah. So whereas, maybe in the past with my tiger parenting mindset, it was more about the results that I got in my children. So needing to create some sort of desired behavior or a result in my children. But I really feel now that my goal or just what is motivating me is my own transformation, my own work that I have to do, where it's not about like, oh, my child reached these goals or listens to me all the time and is polite and whatever. It's like, no, it's about me and my behavior and my growth. And because that's really the only person that I can control,
Yes, their success journey is theirs. It's theirs to define. It's theirs to own fully, and in turn, you get to own your definition of success and really define it for yourself. And that is your work. That is like yours. Like your kids are quote unquote schooling. Like a lot of people will say like that's their job. Like this is your job, like to self-actualize.
Yes, absolutely. So that's something that I write in that chapter as well. Is like, instead of focusing all our, hopes and dreams and everything onto our children, where we're sort of taking over their lives and not giving them freedom, that when we focus on truly living into our own authentic expression of who we want to be and our goals and our dreams in our life, then we feel less less compulsion and less impulse to take over their lives.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of the pressure for our kids to achieve a certain type of success are because of our own unmet desires or needs. And if we can
Yes.
find a way for us to live more fully into ourselves, then we can let go of those expectations for our kids.
Oh, yes. Yes to all of that.
Hmm.
Okay, let's talk about adultism. So some people say childism, some people say adultism. What
Hmm.
is adultism and how can we disrupt it?
I think of adultism as sort of the behaviors that are based on the assumption that adults are better than children or that they have
Mm-hmm.
the right to act upon children in ways simply because they are adults and simply because children are children. And I think this is sort of like an unspoken thing that everybody believes in some ways, or at least we're conditioned to believe because it's so pervasive throughout culture. It's not something that we often question. Um, and yet, just through this journey, realizing how disrespectful and dehumanizing that is, and yeah, like how my own eyes were opened to the way, not only in my parenting, but just in culture in general, that adultism is everywhere. And I write in my book just 3 questions that we can ask ourselves to disrupt this or just to make us more aware of where this is taking place in our lives or where we see it in society, just so that we can um, enlighten ourselves on the reality of this, become more aware, and do our best to fight against it. And so those 3 questions are, would I do this to an adult or a partner or just somebody else that I loved and respected? And I think oftentimes, if we think about it, the answer is no,
Yeah.
where we, whether or not we are like, giving our child a consequence or removing a privilege or yelling at them or interrupting them or whatever it is that we do, if we took a step back and asked, would I do this to my partner or would I do this to an adult friend? It's no. So why do we justify doing it to our children? That's
Yes.
just um, something that we need to be asking ourselves. Like, what is it about my beliefs about children that are making me think that this is okay, right?
Mm.
So that's the first question. I think the second question was, how would I feel if this was done to me? And I think this is also part of our healing journey when we can sort of go back to our inner child and remember how we felt when our parents did these things to us or when adults did these things to us. How disempowered we felt, how helpless, how we internalized these beliefs about, you know, how we were bad or unworthy or whatever those messages were. So I think going back to that question can help us to heal some of our own childhood wounds and help us to really empathize and to step into our children's shoes and realize that, yeah, just to remember what it was like to be this vulnerable child, um, and really question the ways that we treat that vulnerable child. So that was the second question. I think the third question was simply, is this coercive?
Mm.
In um, just mainstream parenting, a lot of the times it is a power over relationship. That's how the parent-child relationship is often framed. The parents have the power, and we use that power over children. And how can we move away from that? Because we don't want relationships that are based on power dynamics, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think when we see that, we just recognize how unhealthy that is. But how can we shift from that to a relationship that is based more on partnership and connection and relationship and trust and all those things that we do want our relationships to be based on, where it is very connected and loving and respectful, and not because somebody has authority over us or has the power to control us. So, yeah, I think that's the third question to really consider and have that lens of whether or not I'm trying to use power over my child in order to get my desired result.
Yes. I sincerely hope that every person listening is like writing these questions down so that they can become a filter in their minds. This childism or adultism, I mean, it's discrimination based on a status, or based on, like racism, discrimination based on race, like childism or adultism, discrimination based on your status as a child. And I love your second question too, about how would it feel, how would you feel if this was done to you? Because what creates this discrimination, this oppression of children, is the intergenerational trauma, right? Because we were treated this way. A lot of us were oppressed as children. And then in adulthood, we're trying to reclaim the power that was taken away from us as children. So it's like, now it's my turn.
Yes.
And that, like, it like feeds something in your inner child that, like, if you're not being really conscious of deconstructing this oppression, this is how it just keeps getting transmitted. Because, like, now it's my turn. So now I get to have all the power, and I get to have this sense of control that I was denied when I was a kid. Now, it's just so easy to slip into that pattern, and it takes some bravery to break out of it. But guys, like, this is how we, like, liberate humanity. Like, I mean, when we're talking about, like, systems of oppression and racism and so many of these big world issues that we need to be actively deconstructing, and we do need to be doing that work. And also, a big part of that happens in your own home, in your own family. When you are raising children, you are constructing the template in their brain of what the relationship should be between someone who has more power or privilege or authority and the person who has less of it. Like, so should that person be dominating and coercing and denying rights and all of these things? I mean, this is really big, important stuff that you can work on directly in your relationship with your kids today.
Yeah, I feel like the impulse to dominate and to control is very much a trauma response.
Yep.
I was just reading this article about this woman who's trying to help white supremacists leave that sort of ideology, because she was caught up in that for several years, and she's trying to help other, people who are radicalized into that. And just how much of that is actually trauma-based, how their attraction towards white supremacy is because of that. And, likewise, when we have this impulse to dominate, to control somebody else, to, prove that we are better than them, or like hold on to our rights and deny theirs, it is very much a trauma response, I think. And so for us to take the time to unpack that, to realize ways that we felt disempowered and oppressed as children, or, in any other context, and to recognize how we are maybe unconsciously perpetuating that in our relationships with our kids.
Yes. I mean, would you say this or do this to someone whom you love and respect? Would you say this to your partner? Like, if my husband was looking the other way and stepping out into the street and a car was coming, I would, like, grab him and move his body back. Like, so that, to me, it's like, okay, yeah, that passes, the like threshold of, is this a loving and respectful thing? So I think sometimes people get confused about, like, So that means I do nothing, like, no, like in a loving, respectful relationship, like there's a partnership, you're working together, there are even boundaries. Like
Yes.
it hurts me when you do this. And so I'm going to request that you do X, are you willing to, whatever, like it's a relationship. There are definitely, there are active roles on both sides, but it's always done with a level of respect that is so often missing in the mainstream adult-child relationship.
Yes.
Okay, acceptance is an essential piece to the peaceful parenting puzzle, and you talked about it so well in your book. So what does it look like to truly accept your child's nature?
I think that just means unconditional love. I mean, it sounds so simple, and yet it's so hard to practice because like so few of us have actually experienced that in our relationships. But I do see that as just unconditional love, where we are not basing our approval or our affection or our love or any of that based on their performance or their behavior or who they will become, where it's very much in the moment. We love them as they are, and we aren't trying to project some sort of ideals upon them, but appreciating and loving them just as they are, whether that's their temperament or their interests or their sexuality or whatever. I would say it's just unconditional love.
Yeah, once you remove, I think there's this foundational piece where once you remove that coercive element, it really frees you to accept your children for exactly who they are today. Because if you believe that it is your job to mold this lump of clay into exactly what you want it to be, you cannot have true acceptance. If that's how you view your role, if that's what you think being a parent means, that is incompatible with acceptance. So once you can get to that position that my role is just to unconditionally love this separate, autonomous human being, that frees you up to be able to accept them for exactly who and how they are at this moment in time today.
Absolutely. And I think it can be complicated because we can sort of sometimes say as parents, well, it's because I love you that I am doing this, whether that's making them take a class they don't want to take or pushing them towards doing something that they don't want to do. Yeah, I think we sort of twist that definition of love. But I think to recognize that what that communicates to the child, like maybe we have the best of intentions, but the impact on our child, this is something that we also talk about in social justice, that it's impact over intention, where we may have the best of intentions as parents to help our child and to show love, but if it doesn't feel loving to them, if it feels very conditional, where they wonder, would my parent love me if I didn't do X, Y, and Z?
Yes.
Then that's what we have to be listening to. It's the experience of our child, is the impact upon them and not our intentions.
Yes. I think one fun way that I like to remind my children of the unconditional nature of our love, just in giving a concrete example of what it might look like, is if they are when they accomplish something big and meaningful to them, I will often remind them, like what I say to them all the time is, I love you forever. And sometimes I'll say I love you forever the same, which they know it's if they're afraid that they're going to fail at something, or if they're excited that they're about to, do something big and meaningful it's either way, at both ends of the spectrum. It's what's going to happen if I don't achieve this thing? And we'll run through okay, so what are some worst case scenarios? Well, you might do X, Y might happen, and I'll love you forever the same. And on the flip side, and what if you do achieve this goal or whatever it is that you're working toward. Well, this could happen and that could happen, and I'll love you forever the same. So it's like, no matter what, like, it's just making clear, like, I will accept you and love you no matter what, the same, like whether you do this thing or don't do this thing. I think like it's worth bringing in like a neurodiversity minute to this bit of the conversation too, because a lot of parents struggle with acceptance when their kids, especially when their kids sort of fall outside of the norm, the like, you know, the neurotypical. And I find that this piece is like even more so important when you have a kid who is neurodiverse in any way, that you can work on helping them to do the things that they want to do and grow into the person that they want to become, but not through a lens of like, we need to fix you and you're broken, because that's not acceptance. Like, no, who you are, exactly who you are supposed to be, and who you are is wonderful in a million different ways, and you can still have challenges just like we all do, and your challenges just happen to look like this. But just coming at that like partnered, supportive allyship kind of work from a place of acceptance, it just changes everything.
Yes, yes. And I feel like with the neurodiversity piece, like I don't think that I have neurodiverse children, but I think there is a way that we can really communicate a lack of acceptance for our neurodiverse children when we are trying to support them, when, you know, we're trying to give them the skills that we think they need in order to function in society. But it often does communicate like, I'm trying to make you fit in, you know, and you're not okay as you are. And so, you know, we have to stop the stimming, or we have to do whatever. And so I do, like what you mentioned, we need to be really careful that it comes from a place of absolute acceptance and unconditional love, so that they know that they are loved as they are, and we're not trying to make them more acceptable in society, you know, or change them in any way. So,
exactly.
Yeah, that's huge.
I really appreciated your encouragement to reject binary distinctions between masculine and feminine as capricious social constructs, and to avoid the presumption of heteronormity. Why did you feel that was important to include?
I think especially, you know, as our collective society is becoming more aware of gender diversity and sexuality, that it's so important, like kids who find that they aren't, you know, they don't fit into the heteronormative groupings, do have this fear and anxiety and question about whether or not they will be accepted as they are by parents. And so it's so important for us to set that foundation for our children and in our society, to let our children know, to let the next generation know that they are loved and accepted just as they are, and that nothing can change that. I think that's such an important message, and especially when we think about just the high rates of suicide in the LGBTQIA community because of a lack of acceptance, whether it be from family or from society at large. I think this is definitely something that we need to begin to shift as a culture, so that children know, that everybody knows that they are unconditionally loved and accepted as they are.
Yes, as the mother of a trans child, this part in the book was especially a nice surprise for me. Sometimes it feels like I'm a bit of like a person standing at the edge of like a cliff with the wind blowing in my face, sort of yelling to no one. So it was so nice to feel like there was someone else out there who was not even in a position of, privilege, right? Like where like you don't have a trans kid or you're not trans yourself, to be saying something like that meant a lot to me. So I really appreciated that. And I think that it's something that's really easy for us to do as parents. Just like when my kids were younger and we would say, we would be talking about marriage or something, I might say like, yeah, well, if you marry or if you have a husband or wife when you grow up, dot, 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 you know, even just like a little like linguistic thing like that, where you're not just saying, well, when your wife someday, or your husband, like even just saying, well, your husband or wife someday, like just a little thing like that, or like your spouse one day. It doesn't even have to be any more words, like just to make these like little shifts communicates to your child. It's like when you say like, oh, well, your wife when you grow up, like it creates this narrow like future of acceptance, whether you really would be accepting or not. You set this very narrow view of their future, whereas just changing a little bit of language like just really widens the future view of acceptance, like that I could fall anywhere in this range and that would still meet with like their full acceptance and even expectation, you know, like just that like the expectation is that much wider.
Yeah, I feel like even because these are messages that we grew up with, and as we become parents and sort of projecting into the future, these hopes and dreams that we have for our children, I think we really need to check ourselves, because even the expectation that our kids would be partnered is something that we assume will happen, and yet that may not be their choice in the future. Right? So when we talk about future kids or, you know, getting married and all that stuff, I think we need to definitely, like you said, you know, have more inclusive language and talk about these different families and different ways of being, so that they know that whatever they choose, that we are on their side.
Yes, even just using the word if instead of when, I mean, goes such a long way. Like, well, if you have children, dot, 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 you know, as these things naturally come up on conversation, instead of like when you have children, just, well, if you have children, yeah, we could keep your train sets and they could play with them if they're asking if they can keep them, you know, like just such simple little things can make a really big difference. I would love to live in a world where people don't have to come out of the closet. Like, that's sort of this like soft dream that like is on my heart, that like if our kids, like there was just no heteronormative cisgender like mold that they assumed they would have to fit into. Like it was just at each stage as your kid got to know themselves better and they just sort of, you know, opened up like a flower, like we would just be a part of that and we would all discover it together, but there wouldn't be this hard expectation that they have to deviate from.
Yeah, we can dream. We can keep on moving towards that vision.
Yes, I'm trying. Okay, let's talk about bodily autonomy. If a parent hasn't been respecting their child's body autonomy, where do you recommend they start?
It's hard to say because there's like so many layers, but I think especially with the whole Me Too movement and with sexual abuse, this is oftentimes the place where most families start in terms of bodily autonomy, which is physical affection, where, you know, we allow our children to express affection in ways that feel comfortable and aligned with what they want to do and not force it upon them, you know, like not forcing them to kiss a relative or hug or whatever that is. So to honor that, I mean, I think that's a very basic and, just a basic step that we can take to, for one, protect them, but also help them have more autonomy. But I think that's just, there's just so many things, so many layers, like even just basic daily activities. You know, I write about food, how food is such a big part of caring for a child, and yet it can be so fraught, especially in the early years when parents feel so responsible for, you know, providing nutrition for the child, and it can really be a source of control and conflict with a child when we force them to clean their plate or, you know, finish their bottle or whatever it is. And so I think that's also another area where we can really begin to practice more of like helping them to be intuitive about their eating. So it's not about control. It's not about power struggles, or reacting to, trying to resist ways that the parent is trying to control, but that they can really be more attuned to their body and what their body needs and respond to that appropriately. So I think that's another area that affects, everyday life, where hopefully parents can, try to release their control and help their kids have more bodily autonomy.
Yes, affection, food, sleep. I mean, anytime you are going to override your child's right of ownership to their own body, like it has to pass a really high bar for me. Like that example earlier, if my kid's about to step out in front of a moving vehicle, like, yes, I will like grab them and pull them back. Like that feels good to me. But like if I want a hug and my kid doesn't, me grabbing them away from what they're doing and pressing them against my body against their will, like that's a clear no. That's a very clear no. And there are a million different examples, like you were saying, across the spectrum. I feel like this is one of those very prominent strands that is woven throughout the relationship between parent and child, that where you are continually presented with opportunities to shift your relationship to one that does not revolve around, that's not rooted in coercion. If you're just focusing on the bodily autonomy piece. For many years, I taught baby massage classes with like parents of newborns. And the first thing we would do is like ask permission. And a lot of the parents in the room would like laugh, at first. But for me, this was the most important piece of all of it. It's like that you ask permission and then you genuinely look to your baby, even like a new baby, for cues as to whether or not they want this touch right now. Like you start by just like pressing your hand on their leg, for example, and like observe in their body and their face, like what they do. And then you start to move very gradually and you're looking for their, now extend that like all the way across, up into the ages, right? Like you maintain that level of respect for their ownership of their body. It's like so simple, and yet you are faced with the opportunity to override their right to ownership over their body 1,000 times in 1,000 small ways every single day.
I think another piece that I wrote about in the book is also that we as parents also have bodily autonomy.
Yes.
And where it's also important for us to be aware of our own bodies and the ways that we want to engage with others with our bodies, so that we aren't, we don't feel resentful because of the ways that people are using our bodies, especially as mothers, where we can feel very touched out, or where there's just a lot of physical demand on our bodies. Like, how can we be attuned to our own bodies and do things consciously and intentionally, instead of just giving away that power to other people who demand it of us. So. Yes,
and what tremendous role modeling too, to be in a partnership with a parent who is in touch with what they're feeling, can communicate that to the person who loves them like non-reactively, and can hold boundaries for their preferences in any given moment, like unapologetically and yet gently and respectfully, to communicate those in loving relationships. Like, what a tremendous gift when you're able to do that for yourself and for your children.
Yeah.
Okay, sometimes when one is doing the work of deconstructing that power and control-based parenting they inherited, they can swing too far the other way into permissive parenting, which is not gentle or peaceful parenting. You conceptualize permissive parenting as taking personal freedom to the point of infringing upon the freedom, respect, and well-being of others, becoming complicit in oppression. Talk to us about that.
So I think, just our discussion previously about boundaries is like, I feel like permissive parenting doesn't have good boundaries, where we do sort of give up our role and our own autonomy and allow our children to do whatever they want. So it's, more like laissez-faire parenting.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hands off, and where we're sort of talking about, respecting our kids' autonomy and freedom and individuality and all that stuff. But there is no sense of relationship and connection and trust because, like we talked about before, there is a time for boundaries. There
Yeah.
is a time for no, that in relationship, it's not always yes. It's not do whatever you want because relationships don't work that way.
Yeah.
Like the way I framed it in the beginning of the book is a give and take relationship. It's not just one side giving and the other side taking. There is this dance and this relationship that we negotiate together. So it requires a lot of communication. But the problem with permissive parenting is that it can, create this sense of entitlement for those that are always taking,
Mm-hmm.
where they are not held responsible for behaviors that affect other people. They don't know how to repair. So there's just a lot of things that permissive parenting can actually perpetuate. And so, just in the bigger view of things, looking at what's happening in our country, in the States right now, with these insurrectionists and these white supremacists who are all about their personal freedoms and their right to do all these things, but are unable to listen to other people, to consider how their actions are affecting other people, and unable to take responsibility for their actions. So definitely, it's not just this coercive type of parenting that can lead to oppression, but permissive parenting as well.
Yes, yes. Like we have three agreements in our family that you respect yourself, you respect others, and you respect the environment. And as long as you are as long as you are aligned with those three agreements, like freedom, like is our default setting. But
Mm-hmm.
if you bump up against like falling out of alignment with one of those values, like if you are disrespecting another person by like hitting them or hurting them with your words or,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it may be, like that's when we have to step in and help our children to get back in alignment with those values. And for
Mm-hmm.
exactly the reasons you described, like we we don't want to become complicit in oppression. And if you communicate to your child at a very young age that their freedom is more important than the safety or the rights of other people, like that's a dangerous position to be in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially for those who do have power and privilege, that
Yeah.
it's very important for us to parent our children in a way where they do learn to respect other people and
Yeah.
not to, just give them free reign to do whatever they want.
Yeah. Well, many of us are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a triangle that places physiological needs like food and sleep as the foundation at the bottom and self actualization at the top. In the book, you explain that he appropriated this concept from the indigenous Blackfoot Nation and how his misinterpretation is worth examining. And I'm going to read a quote from your book here. The Blackfoot's original conceptualization was a teepee, but instead of self actualization being at the top, self actualization actually formed the foundation at the bottom, with community actualization above it and cultural perpetuity at the top. That is a profound concept to have sitting on our brains while I ask you what advice you have for people longing for community but unsure where to begin.
I Yeah, I think because like even though we talk, because Maslow's really talking about self-actualization, and in the early parts of my book, it does feel, a lot about us doing our personal work that we need to do. But near the end, or middle, second half into the end of the book, I really talk about this community aspect and this belief that we are tied to something greater than just what's happening in our nuclear families. And so I think this framework that the Blackfoot have is so much more helpful, where we're not just siloed in our own family and wanting to make change that way, but that we are connected to a greater culture and hopefully, shifting the reality for generations to come, that it is important for us to think beyond just, the temporal, what's happening here with me and my family, but really to think beyond that. And so it is important for us to do this as a community, for me not just to want to untiger and do this shift for the sake of my own family, which is true, but wanting to shift as a culture, wanting to shift in community with other people who have that same vision and hope. And so there are so many things that we can do. It's hard because those who need the most support and need the most community are often the ones with the least spoons.
Yeah.
They don't have the energy to go and seek out community. So I would say for those of us who do have more capacity, that we would be aware of those who are struggling and that we would take the step to reach out and try to care for those who are struggling, whether they be single parents or, other marginalized groups or whatever, that we take the step. Because sometimes, I can fall into the mentality of, it's up to us to build the community we want. And in some ways that's true, but also, some people just don't have that capacity. And so because we want to see this change on a cultural level, on a societal level, how can those of us with more capacity, more resources, more power and privilege do the work that we need to do and that we can do to help support other parents? So I think that's something that I just encourage parents to do. And I think another thing is just to be willing to ask for help, to be willing to be vulnerable, and to not try to do this on our own because we weren't meant to. So just reaching out to people, letting people know what our needs are. And I think my own experience is that when I have done that, it's been incredible to see the response and, where people are wanting to support one another. Oftentimes we just don't know how to. And so if we can be vulnerable enough to communicate our needs and ask for help, that can create the sense of community and mutual caring for one another that we all need as parents.
That is a lovely note to end on as we move into our deep dive. So the show notes can be found at rachelrainbolt.com/podcast56, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. Now, Iris, what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic? And of course, we have to start with reading your Untigering book, which of course I'm going to link to in the show notes and everywhere where I talk about this episode.
Yes, thank you. Yes, please buy the book and read it. And you can also subscribe to my blog, untigering.com. I have an Untigering Parents community on Facebook, so especially for Asian Americans and other people who are wanting to untiger, I think that's just is a growing community, and I'm really thankful for it. And just like we were saying, that we need each other, we need support, and sometimes it's in person, and sometimes, well, especially now, for it to be online is hugely helpful as well. So I encourage people to join that group as well.
Yes, and follow Iris on Instagram. You have a Facebook page too, but I think I first got connected to you on Instagram. I've been following for a long time and like cheering you on, being like, yeah, she's awesome. And then you came out with a book, and it far surpassed my expectations. So go read her book, go follow along with her book, and let's get working on deconstructing all of these familial constructs of oppression.
Yes. Thank you so much.